Like we was in school, there was throwing glass at black people and little kids.
I think it's gonna be all right if everybody come and stop being scared, because shoot, I don't think there's nothing to be scared of.
Could you give me a brief introduction about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So my name is Edith Bazile. I am originally from Boston. I grew up in Roxbury with 13 brothers and sisters in a poor neighborhood where my family's in a two-parent family where my parents own a three-family house, which we grew up in. I went to Boston Public Schools in an urban district where I faced a lot of discrimination as a Black child who came from poverty, but had a lot of pride and came from a very religious family. I proceeded as a result of my education to go back to my school and to become a teacher that I didn't have in my school district. And I was driven by the underachievement that was expected of me and the miseducation that I was provided to go back to school, because there were so many like me that I saw who dropped out in high school. So I became an educator and I rose up the ranks, and I experienced discrimination and racism in the district, not as a student now, but as an educator. I'm now retired after 32 years, and I also worked in higher education, training teachers. And I now am retired, and I work as an advocate, a community organizer. I do volunteer work. I also presented at AERA last year in 2021 on educators as social justice advocates. I presented at Harvard University in the graduate school at an Ask With forum on a similar topic. So I do this work as a volunteer because I do believe it's time for us to really address these systemic issues that generation after generation leave specifically our Black students behind. And my work is really focused on Black students. And I feel that if we address the issues of Black students, we are addressing the issues of all students who are marginalized by the system. So just as the civil rights movement, we fought for the civil rights of ourselves, we fought for immigration rights, we fought for the rights of others. And so that's how I view my work.
Well, thank you. That is a very good introduction to what I wanted to talk to you about, which was the desegregation of Boston Public Schools in the 70s and 60s. So can you give me like a brief overview of your memory of that time and how it affected you?
Sure. So I think the most impactful piece is that on the heels of desegregation in Boston specifically, because I was educated in a segregated system. So in the schoolyard, we sang songs that were racist. We didn't know it at the time, but things like, if you're white, you're all right. If you're brown, stick around. If you're Black, step back. We didn't know it was racist, but it was internalized in our brains. And I didn't learn those from my community. I learned that from the school I attended. And another one was eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch an N-word by the toe. If he hollers, let him go, eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Those are the kinds of songs that we were inducted to. And we didn't read any stories that reflected us in an aspirational way. We were told that we were taken from Africa, we were savages. We were sort of saved and placed into slavery where we were more like pets. And we had a better life and we were civilized. And so that was the education that I got when I went to Boston Public Schools. And I didn't learn anything positive or aspirational about people who looked like me. And so here we are at desegregation in Boston. We knew that we couldn't go to South Boston because it was dangerous. And we were told that. We couldn't go to Carson Beach. We couldn't go to certain neighbors in Dorchester. We were very clear that we had to stay in the safety of our own neighborhood. So now we have desegregation. And all of a sudden there's busing. I was not bused, but my sisters and brothers were bused. I'll tell you just about my sister. It was a huge thing. It was all that we heard on the news. I frequently saw Louise Day Hicks, screaming these racist tropes about Black people. And I always wondered, why does she hate us so much? And so here we are. My younger sister was bused to South Boston High School. Her first day, there was no preparation. Parents were not met with and told, oh, we have a new system. Your child is going to go into this neighborhood. We're going to have police escorts. It was sort of an induction into desegregation without any preparation whatsoever. So my sister goes on the bus, and as soon as the bus turns the corner into South Boston, into that area, the parents were already sitting on the porches. They had bananas in their hands, they had rocks and bottles, and they threw rocks. The police could not stop the rocks from hitting the bus and the students. My sister got hit by a rock. And one of the most memorable moments that she has, and she won't even talk about it to this day, is the residents, these are adults, sitting on the porch with bananas, imitating monkeys, and just and eating bananas, peeling the bananas and jumping around and imitating monkeys. And she says to me that if this was not so terrifying, it would be comical because they did such a good job. They prepared to harass and terrorize these young Black children who just wanted an education. And after about 2 or 3 days, she was so traumatized, she refused to go to school. She hid under the bed, she hid in the closet. She ended up quitting school. She would not go back to school and did not get her, finish her education until she got a GED when she was an adult. So these kind of stories of the trauma that children face, my trauma in terms of what I was told, nothing good looked like me. I was, less than human. I was told, my parents were told that I had borderline intelligence, that I was not college material. I was told that's my face by my high school teachers. Oh, you can't go to college. College is not for you. It's not going to work. Just forget about it. And so these kind of messages about us as Black folks, and we're children, that we are not worthy, we are not human, we're not deserving of the kinds of things that we aspire to. Because children have dreams. They want to, be somebody when they grow up. They have aspirations. I wanted to be a teacher, and I was told, no, you can't be a teacher. But I knew I could in my heart. Yeah. So that desire was not dampened by what my teacher said, because at home, my parents would have Saturday school. We would study our own Black history, and we learned about ourselves. So we had a contradictory education in Boston Public Schools that told us that we were worthless, that our Black skin made us inferior. And although those words weren't used, it was conveyed in every other way that, because you're Black, because you're female, because you grew up in this neighborhood, you're worthless. And so those are the kinds of overt and covert messages that our children get that we need to change. And in 2022, we still struggle with that. That there has not been a reckoning on race. There has not been a reconciliation. There has been no healing from the trauma and pain that children suffer when they go into schools and they don't see people who look like them. So with desegregation, unfortunately, primarily in the South, the unintended consequence, the ugly impact of desegregation was that Black schools were closed, Black teachers' unions were forced to disband, and the white unions did not protect Black teachers. The desegregated schools refused to hire Black teachers. And so over 40 years after desegregation happened here in Boston, well, it's been more than that, since 1974, I believe. The school district still does not have a representation of Black teachers. Why? Because despite a court order, there was a Gary decision. Schools still have not hired Black teachers. And that's been a problem of desegregation, that the white schools, the desegregated schools that were led primarily by white teachers, white administrators, refused to hire credentialed Black teachers. And so because Black teachers are not represented by the unions in a way that they should be, Black teachers have been shut out. And so the irony of it is that there was a study by Johns Hopkins University that talked about the benefits of a Black student having a Black teacher. Seeing someone who looks like you and is standing in front of a classroom provides that student the hope. I can be like my teacher. My teacher looks like me. I can aspire to be a teacher, because you can't be what you don't see. And so that is the problem with not having Black teachers. And the Johns Hopkins study said that if a Black student has one Black teacher in those developmental years, like before the 3rd grade, just for 1 year, it improves for Black boys the graduation rate by, I believe, is 39%. And for Black girls, it improves the graduation by 29%. And so, but it also improves the overall outcome of all students. This study said that even white students, Latino students prefer Black teachers. And it goes back to the civil rights struggle, that we struggle for our rights and liberation, but also for the rights and liberation of everyone else. And so if you really think about that, it's important to note that Black teachers are critical in the development and the education of Black students. So that if I have a Black teacher, I can aspire to be what I see. And I didn't have a Black teacher when I was growing up, but somewhere in my brain, because my parents held a Saturday school and they had us to read Black history, I saw those figures like Carter G. Woodson. I saw those figures like James Baldwin. I read Man-Child in the Promised Land, and other books, Black Boy by Richard Wright. So I knew that there was something more than what my teachers were telling me, because I had an education outside of that. And so that's what's so critically important now, that our students post desegregation do not have a cadre of highly effective, highly credentialed Black teachers, because they are not hired and they are not retained by this public education system, which still is rooted in the false ideology of white supremacy.
So a part of what I've been trying to understand is sort of like how Boston as a city is still very segregated, and sort of how we don't talk about how segregated we are as a city. You know, we hide our history of desegregation and busing. Like, we had some of the worst riots around desegregation in Boston, and we don't talk about that history, and we don't talk about how currently Boston is still very segregated, and Black students in Boston still have like underfunded and under-resourced high schools. So why is that? Why is the public memory of this traumatic event in the city so hidden and so buried? Do you have any ideas about that?
Well, I think it's calcified by the political, economic, and social power that rests with white communities and wealthy communities. So you have the business community, you have redlining, you have gentrification. I mean, all of these are codified by laws and policies that are created in terms of where people live, what access they have. And so, yes, it's the school system, but it is the whole governmental process. Racism, and specifically anti-blackness, which is the root of racism. Racism emerged from the need to justify enslavement of African people. And so that history, that shame, if that is to be recognized and if that is dealt with, you have to talk about reconciliation, you have to talk about healing, and you have to talk about reparations. So how do you repair that damage? Well, there's no ownership. So to talk about racism and to dismantle racism means that there is an education debt owed to those people who were denied opportunities, who were kidnapped and enslaved for centuries, and on whom's back this economic foundation of this country was built. So if you really think about that, to talk about racism is to talk about reparations, because you have to repair the damage, but you also have to enter into some healing, which has not happened in this city. And so if you look at public education was started, the first school was Boston Latin School, which was in 1635. But slavery in Boston did not end until the 1700s. And so these schools they were designed for people who did not look like me, because education was denied. Education creates liberation. If you are educated, then you can liberate yourself. And so the denial of education was purposeful in order to maintain control, but also to maintain power and to perpetuate the inability to be economically self-sufficient. And so if you look at the structure of Boston now, we still have a two-track system. We don't have that economic power. We don't have communities that have businesses that hold money within the community that is turned over within the community over and over again. The money that occurs in Black neighborhoods, not communities, goes outside. People come in and they utilize the Black community to make money, and they take those funds outside. And yes, Black students are trapped, and it's intentional, in the most underfunded, under-resourced, understaffed, and underperforming schools over and over and over again. White students as a group do not have that problem. If you look at the tiers of high-performing schools, they're primarily populated with white students. The tiers of underperforming schools are primarily populated with Black students. That is a historical pattern, and it's intentional based on policy, because that's where the economics lie. And unfortunately, when you look at exam schools, AP courses, advanced work classes, that's also a track for white students, where Black students tracked into dead-end, substantially separate special education programs that often do not lead to diplomas. They also end up being targeted by police, Black boys. And what research says, and if you look at schools in Boston, the more Black students in a school, the more you're going to see metal detectors, administrative searches, the presence of school police, which they now call safety officers. But that's part of the hypersurveillance and the focus on controlling students instead of educating them. And so there is racialized tracking in Boston. There is low-end education. Dr. Carter G. Woodson wrote a book, Miseducation of the American Negro, back in the 1930s. He went to Harvard, and it talks about the same thing that the Johns Hopkins study talks about most recently, I believe it was in 2015, where you have the same tracking, and you have a lack of Black teachers. So I think that Boston Public Schools still struggles to hire and retain Black teachers, because we have not had a candid conversation on racism. Boston often talks about, oh, we're focused on equity, but that's sort of a smokescreen for the real issue. Like, when are we going to talk about the racism in Boston that no one wants to utter, and specifically anti-blackness, because schools are a caste system, and it perpetuates a caste system in society where Black students are at the bottom of the hierarchy and white students are at the top. And it's perpetuated by these false myths of who is capable to get into a high-performing program or school and who is not. And part of the gatekeeping strategy is using bias testing. We know about eugenics and how that perpetuated the myth of intelligence, and it was based upon white culture. Well, if you're not exposed to white culture, assessing someone based upon that worldview or mental model is biased. It would be wrong to, and back in the old days, they would have on a test item, what do you do on a snowy day? Well, if you're from a country where it doesn't snow, everyone knows that's a biased test. And you're not going to be able to write that essay because you have not experienced snow. And so that's that is sort of a glaring example of what bias could occur. So if you look at the assessments that are designed, I'll give you one clear example. So there was an MCAS question in 2010 based upon the Underground Railroad. It was about a young Black girl, Cora, who was a runaway enslaved person, and she was staying at an abolitionist house. The abolitionist was the husband, the wife, Ethel, was the racist, and really was very offended and had a hatred for Cora. So Cora is hiding, and Ethel is mistreating her. She's saying that she's smelly. She's really using a lot of pejorative terms towards towards Cora. And so on the MCAS question, because we don't have Black teachers representing how you design these assessments, the question was, write an essay and provide the perspective of Ethel, the racist. And so you have Black children sitting and looking at this essay question, and they're empathetic with Cora, the runaway slave, because Cora looks like me. She's Black, and I empathize with her struggle. And so that created trauma for Black children. So if you think about that one item, and so the long story short, the Department of Elementary Secondary Education in Massachusetts threw out the question. But think of the 2 years of having a team invested in time, in money, in constructing these tests, publishing the tests, all of the funding that goes into that. You know, the think tank part, the research that goes behind it. And they came up with this question that was a biased question that traumatized Black students. Why? Because there was no representation on these committee that designed this assessment. And so if you magnify that by what happens on a day-to-day basis in terms of what Black students are taught about themselves, about their history, the true history, these are the reasons that we have the gaps. And you know, the gaps are constructed. I say that, you know, if you have, if someone is a victim of strangulation, you don't say they stopped breathing, they were killed. So the school policies are killing the achievement of Black students. It is not Black students who are failing. The system is designed to choke out their ability to be successful in a curriculum that doesn't reflect them, in an assessment process that is biased, in a teaching force that doesn't understand their cultural lens and their way of thinking, and may find the way that they think, walk, talk, and behave offensive. And so you have Black students that do not have the nurturing and the type of culture that acknowledges and nurtures their intellect, their gifts, and their talents. And their funds of knowledge and their ways of knowing. And so that was my experience. And unfortunately, it still is the experience of many Black students who go through this system. And so I say, I survived Boston Public Schools. I did not thrive from it. I survived it, and I succeeded in spite of it, not because of it. And it really is where I had to step back and do some healing.